Vasul Bala Venkatesh, thank you so much for having us here in Moscow. Очень приятно сам to meet you here. I'm sorry about my Russian. I've forgotten it over the years. But if you can talk about a little bit more about India-Russia ties, relations in context of what's been happening in the last month. Prime Minister Modi's bilateral meeting with President Putin in Vladivostok, apart from the EEF. The significance of that or the difference from before.
Amitabh, добро пожаловать. Очень рад встретиться с вами в Москве, особенно посольство Индии. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the embassy and our best wishes to SNI, your first foray into Moscow and to Russia, and we hope that this is the beginning of a good engagement, especially on media affairs, especially on the topics that you deal with, which is strategy, geopolitics, and international politics. I would say that it would not be possible to discuss any of these topics without bringing in Russia, and of course, India-Russia relations. Prime Minister paid a visit to Vladivostok as the chief guest at the Eastern Economic Forum at the invitation of President Putin. Parallelly, we also had the 20th annual summit between India and Russia. The 20th has a significance. The annual summit has a significance. There is practically no other country in the world where India has had annual summits regularly without fail for the last 20 years. So that says something about the long-term nature of the India-Russia strategic partnership. It is truly special and it's truly privileged. And that was well in evidence in Vladivostok, where Prime Minister was there. Prime Minister spent almost 10 hours of FaceTime with President Putin. That speaks to the quality of the personal relationship that is there between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. It's hard to find parallels of that nature. Prime Minister was also the chief guest at the Eastern Economic Forum. Prime Minister Modi's visit to Vladivostok is the first visit by any Indian Prime Minister to Vladivostok. So we are opening up new vistas in an old relationship. And that has great significance for our bilateral relationship for the future. An old relationship, of course, has very strong roots, but for a tree to grow, you need new branches. And interregional cooperation is, I think, one of the branches that sprouted very well in Vladivostok. So we are looking at a diversification in terms of regional interaction and diversification in terms of our economic interaction. The traditional pillars of India-Russia relationship, as you know, you have been a long-term student and follower of our relationship, have been defense, nuclear space, and energy. These will continue to be important in the future. In defense, more than 60 to 70% of our armed forces have either Soviet origin or Russian weapons. But the nature of the defense relationship is gradually changing. While we have a number of full weapon platforms which are of Russian supplied or Russian origin, the emphasis from here on will be on Make in India.
And developed jointly, possibly?
Indeed. Make in India defense component, I think, got a major boost when there was, in the Vladivostok summit, we signed the intergovernmental agreement on manufacture of spare parts. So the way it would work from here on is that while spare parts were supplied by Russian OEMs, hereafter there would be joint ventures between Indian companies and Russian companies, especially in the OEM sector. And the defense manufacture is envisaged within India. That would, of course, lead to a decrease in cost, timely supplies, and of course, progressive indigenization of the weapons concern. Nuclear, we're doing exceedingly well. We have 6 nuclear power plants that have already been assigned for the Kudankulam site. 2 are already in operation. Kudankulam 3 and 4 are under construction. The land site has been already excavated for Kudankulam 5 and 6. Both sides are in touch for a discussion on a second site that will, of course, come up in the future. Of course, we need to first find a second site that is suitable for a string of Russian reactors to come, but that only gives you an idea of how far we intend to progress. There is definitely a focus on third-party cooperation. Rupur nuclear power plant in Bangladesh is a good example. But based on the good experience that we already have with Russia, along with the friendly country of Bangladesh, we are looking for additional opportunities elsewhere, including with reactors that are specifically designed in India for export purposes. Space has, of course, been an area of cooperation that is of significance both to India and Russia. This will take a new leap forward when astronauts who will finally fly on the Gaganyaan program will be selected and trained at Russian institutions. And in addition to the training that they will undergo in Russia, in India, this is yet another dimension of our cooperation. In energy, we already have made some important investments in Sakhalin 1 and Vankor. We intend to take this forward. Just before Prime Minister's visit to Vladivostok, we had the visit of the Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas, Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan. There was agreement on a 5-year program for import of cooperation in the hydrocarbon sector. That includes both Indian investments in Russia as well as Russian investments in India. And so the cooperation is now being taken forward in a manner where we will assign Russia an important place for long-term, assured, predictable, affordable energy supplies. And Russia will definitely be a part of the multipolar and multiple supply structure that we are building for our future energy security. With respect to inter-regional cooperation, you would have noted that for the first time, India will extend a soft line credit of $1 billion for the Russian Far East. This is to enable Indian and Russian companies to look at opportunities that exist in the fields of energy, infrastructure, agriculture, timber, diamonds, and other areas.
So
and
how does it work? Does this line of credit for Indian companies to invest in Russia? Or?
The line of credit will be operated by our Exim Bank.
Yeah.
Our Exim Bank will enter into an agreement with a corresponding Russian bank. The line of credit will be available for projects that are both approved by the Indian government and the Russian government. And we will take this forward. But it is a concessional line of credit in favorable terms than what is available in the market. And that is intended to give a boost to Indian companies to find partners in Russia, to find opportunities that will actually build on India's needs, especially in energy, in timber, agriculture, diamonds is another area. Our Prime Minister has been emphasizing that we need to also look at migration. Indian labor has contributed to the development of many regions in the world, and the Russian side is very positive on this area. So a combination of entrepreneurship, capital, new technology, and a new enthusiasm focused on the Russian Far East, we hope will bring huge dividends in the future. This is another example where an old relationship acquires new branches, and therefore the vitality of the India-Russia tree is, we can describe it as an evergreen tree because it's under constant renewal. and Prime Minister's visit to Vladivostok, I think, is a good example of that.
Pascal, this branch that you're talking about in an old tree, when it's the far east of Russia, which has such vast potential and hardly any population or utilization of those resources, how does that play out with what's happening between Russia and China, say, in that area? And why is Russia so interested in India coming in there?
Of course, the development of the Russian Far East is a priority for President Putin. The Russian Far East is twice the size of India. Its total population is 16 million. But it also has a huge amount of natural resources. So therefore, it's a challenge for Russia. It's a challenge that the Russian government is prepared to take. But part of the Russian design for their own development of their own Far East is to involve partners, both immediate neighbors of Russia in the Russian Far East, but also trusted partners like India. Russia has neighbors such as China, Korea, and Japan. They have been active in the Russian Far East. But it is very significant that President Putin invited Prime Minister Modi to be the chief guest at the Eastern Economic Forum. The message is very clear. Russia is looking for multiple partners. And we, as India, are prepared to engage with Russia. Firstly, because of our strategic partnership with Russia. Secondly, Russia has an interest in the region because that is an area that will be pivotal to the future development of the Indo-Pacific. We are looking at developing the Chennai-Vladivostok connectivity route. That will feed into the route that will lead into the Northern Sea route to the Arctic.
What's the specifics of that to understand in terms of a layman, this Chennai-Vladivostok?
See, in the old days, during the Soviet period, there were shipping lines between Chennai and Vladivostok. But with the breakdown of the Soviet Union and the focus initially in Russia on the Western European sector, many of the shipping lines have either fallen into disuse. So therefore, we are creating the incentives, both regulatory and commercial incentives, for shipping lines to resume between Chennai and Vladivostok. But it's not just Vladivostok. I think we are looking at investments. We already have investments in the Russian Far East, including in Sakhalin. Some of the projects that we are discussing today with Russia for long-term supplies of LNG, oil and gas from the Arctic will involve shipping routes that will also go into the Northern Sea route. So actually we are looking at a connectivity arc, a geopolitical arc that will extend from Chennai in India right up to Vladivostok, and that will go around Kamchatka into Yamal. So this is a huge geopolitical arc that will involve energy, economic development, connectivity, and geopolitics. So therefore, this again is an indication that Russia is an important player in what we consider as the Indo-Pacific. Russia is already a major Pacific power. India is a major Indian Ocean power. Just as we have an interest in the Pacific Ocean, Russia has an interest in the Indian Ocean. And you look at connectivity in its totality with respect to the geopolitics of the region and the geoeconomics of the region. The arc will extend, as I said, from the southern tip of India right across to the northern tip of the Arctic. Right. So obviously this is an area that is on the threshold of geopolitics. And we are engaged, and Prime Minister's visit to Vladivostok is a very clear signal that India is determined to play its part in this development for the next decades.
Best, like you're saying, Prime Minister was a chief guest at the EF. Last year it was Xi Jinping. Do India and Russia see eye to eye, or how, when you're talking about geopolitics in terms of multiple poles in the world, do we see it the same way?
You see, Russia and India have excellent bilateral relations. We are also have a similar conception of how the world ought to be structured. There are commonalities in the fact that neither country wants a unipolar world. On the same token, neither country wants a free-for-all in the international structure. Both countries are interested in a multipolar world. Both countries are also interested in a multipolar world that is also not unipolar in the Indo-Pacific region. India and Russia cooperate bilaterally, but they also cooperate multilaterally. But they are also part of several structures that bring them together, in particular the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and the RIC, which is Russia, India, China. So you will have several concentric circles which overlap to a very considerable extent. I would say that maybe there is not total overlap. That is not possible. Given the geopolitical situation, location of Russia, which is both a European power and an Asian power, and India, which is both an Asian power and a maritime power. But the amount of commonality that we see between India and Russia, I would say, is difficult to find with respect to any other pair of foreign policy relationships that you see across the world. And that, in a sense, provides a clue as to why there has been so much continuity. In fact, strategic continuity in the India-Russia relationship as compared to other relationships. We've had old relationships, such as with Russia. We have new relationships now, relatively new, as with the United States or with the European Union. But Russia combines the strength of the old and the new. And my sense is that essentially there is a geopolitical convergence and compatibility between India and Russia. And that is the primary driver for why India and Russia find themselves with such great intrinsic strength in their strategic partnership that has moved from decade to decade and from strength to strength. We are indeed very fortunate that Prime Minister Modi has placed special emphasis on Russia and has focused on Russia, drawing on its strengths as to see how they would benefit India in the current flux, strategic flux in the international situation, and India's needs, its economic developments, its defense requirements, space, nuclear, energy, high technology. And I must say, Prime Minister Modi and President Putin also have considerable interest with respect to tiger conservation.
Oh, yes.
So in the Vladivostok summit, both of them decided that it would be good if India were to host a high-level meeting on tiger conservation sometime next year in India.
This intrinsic and strength between the relations between the two countries and the longevity, now that's a given. How important is it, or how additionally important is it for the two leaders to have a personal kind of relationship of the kind they have?
Oh, it makes all the difference between a very good relationship and a very special relationship. Particularly at this time when there's such great churning in the international system, when change is so swift and so deep, when established frameworks are eroding as we speak, it is very important that leaders have a relationship of trust and confidence, because that then becomes an anchor for constructing uh, policies and programs of cooperation that are sustainable, that have a meaning both to the decision-making elites on both sides, but also the implementing structures, both in India and in Russia. So a signal from the top, a very positive signal from the top, is always a very good impetus for not just putting together innovative programs, but also ensuring their implementation.
And again, on issues that are decisions that are taken internally in India, we've seen how Russia on the international stage is also behind India's position. I'm talking about Kashmir, whether they asked a question individually on that or whether it's in a multilateral organization like the United Nations where they've supported India's stand on that when others have tried to muddy the waters, so as to speak.
Of course, that has been one of the defining features of our relationship with Russia. You maybe recall that during the Soviet period, the Soviet Union exercised almost more than 100 times a veto in favor of India to protect India's interests in the UN Security Council. Even today, Russia has a very consistent position on Kashmir. They see the state of Jammu and Kashmir as an integral part of India. They believe that any issue between India and Pakistan ought to be discussed bilaterally, directly between them, without third-party mediation, on the basis of the Simla Agreement and the Lahore Declaration of 1999. This is a very solid position. This is a very consistent position. And if you say what does India make of the Russian position, we believe that this is rock solid and solidly behind India.
Again, when you're talking about Kashmir, Pakistan tried to link Afghanistan and the peace process there with what's happening in Kashmir. It's very interesting that the Taliban themselves came out with a statement saying that that's not going to happen. In terms of the Taliban, we've seen how post President Trump calling off the talks, which seem to be gaining momentum again to restart. The Taliban have visited Russia, spoken to Special Representative here. They've visited China, they've visited Iran. What's Russia's relationship with the Taliban, with Afghanistan, with the US in that whole process?
Well, historically, Russia has always paid attention to what happens in Afghanistan. Of course, history has not always provided the best outcomes, yes. Especially for Russian policy. But there are certain common elements, irrespective of the era in which Russia is engaged with Afghanistan. Like India, Russia too believes that Afghanistan should not be a country that becomes the base for terror groups, particularly those with virulently anti-Russian ideologies, Islamic terror groups, to find a base. They are also interested in not allowing the neighbors of Afghanistan, particularly Pakistan, to determine the future of Afghanistan. These two commonalities actually are common to both India and Russia. Of course, we approach the Afghan situation slightly differently today. Russia has engaged with the Taliban, India has not. Russia has engaged more directly with the United States and China in creating a trilateral. They also have a trilateral plus Pakistan, which was created, which first met in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. They are engaged diplomatically. They've also hosted what was called the Moscow format meeting. And India sent an unofficial delegation, primarily to account for the fact that the Taliban were also in the room. But these are times when a lot of change is happening on the ground as we speak. Afghanistan is an area that Russia is engaged more diplomatically for the past year. Uh, their bottom line is that the threat that emanates from Afghanistan should not impact on security of Central Asia and therefore with respect to Russia. We have similar interests. We would just as much we like the security of Central Asia to be protected. We would also like Afghanistan to be a country that preserves the achievements in various fields: political, economic, social, educational, cultural, in the last 18 years. The wishes and priorities of the Afghan people should come first, and the Afghan people should be allowed to develop their country without external interference. There is a good tradition of consultations between India and Russia. We may not agree on everything, but I think the fundamental objectives are such that India and Russia will continue to work together, irrespective of the change of circumstances on the ground in Afghanistan. This is an area that concerns us both. There is no fundamental contradiction in our interests. And Russia, as a major player, is also a member of the Security Council. Similarly, Russia clearly recognizes India as a country that is essential for sustainable peace and security in Afghanistan. So I think there is a lot of common ground to take both countries together.
Talking about common ground, when I was speaking to the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, she said India and Russia's ties are on the same page because they are very pragmatic. Is that how you view it as well?
Of course, good pragmatism comes out of solid principle. And I think we are in a happy state with India-Russia relations where principle and pragmatism go together. The principal issues on which India and Russia agree are long-standing, consistent, and structured in such a way that India and Russia relate to each other at multiple levels, bilaterally, regionally, internationally. Fundamentally, Russia welcomes India's growth. It is one of those major powers that has historically felt that India's rise is in its own interests. And therefore, there are several key examples in which Russia, previously the Soviet Union, allowed us to the extent that our ties are non-ideological, they are also pragmatic. So therefore, we don't proceed from any preconceived notions. We assess every development on its merits. There is a long history of cooperation and therefore of trust. So therefore, the chances that we will find common ground on any particular international development is much higher with Russia than with many other countries.
Ambassador, but many would say that Russia is a poor cousin in terms of India's relationships with other big powers, especially with the United States, despite the longevity of our relationship.
India's relationship with Russia stand on their own merits and cannot be really compared to any other relationship. Russia, I think, is just too big to be the poor cousin to any other relationship or to any other country. Having said that, our relationship with the United States also stands on its own merits. It is a relatively new relationship. It's probably 2.5 decades old. In historic terms, we have a long way to go. There is every reason for India to explore every opportunity and every benefit, economic, social, technological, geopolitical, that we can derive from our relationship with the United States. Our relationship with Russia, our relationship with the United States, as they stand on their own merits, is also true of our relationship with the other major powers. This, in fact, is the true essence of multipolarity. Multipolarity means that we have the opportunity the incentive, the will and the capabilities to explore opportunities that are thrown up by a world that is restructuring. There are inherent strengths in the India-Russia relationship based on trust, based on long-term interests, which give us the certainty that certain fundamentals will not be affected by any of our other relationships. That is well understood in Russia. I presume it is also well understood in the United States. It is definitely well understood in Europe. Having said that, we do need to find ways of developing our relations with major powers on parallel but non-contradictory tracks. Our record in this respect has been pretty above average. In fact, India's success in diplomacy can be defined in the success it has had so far in pursuing positive, productive relations with all the major powers. So if you ask me what is the defining feature of India's success in current diplomacy, I think India's ability under Prime Minister Modi to pursue and deepen relations with all the major powers, I think is a defining feature of our success at the present time.
When you're talking about current diplomacy, considering what's happening between the US and Russia, between the US and China, what's happening between Russia and China? Would you qualify that as an alliance in building or an alliance already in place?
Well, Russia and China have an old strategic partnership. It's more than 2 decades old. They also have an architecture of relationship which is fairly intense. They have a defense relationship, they have an energy relationship and a trade relationship. The bilateral trade is over $100 billion. Russia has signed long-term energy supply arrangements with China that will last for the next 30 years. Having said that, this is a strategic partnership, but it is not an alliance. It is important to note where Russia and China agree, but it is also important to note where their differences are quite manifest. For instance, Russia has extended political support for the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, but has not endorsed any BRI projects. Russia's perception of integration of the Eurasian continent, the greater Eurasian partnership, is not identical to the principles of the One Belt, One Road initiative. Russia is very active in the Middle East. It has had huge successes in Syria, where you yourself have done some excellent reporting. China is definitely not in the same league. In Europe, relations between Russia and China are cordial, but they don't have identical views on all the issues in Europe. Russia has made it a point to increase its strategic partnership with ASEAN. Russia has its own view on maritime security. So while there would be large areas where Russia and China have common views, it would be a mistake to call it an alliance.
Посол Varma, очень приятно встретить с вами в вашем доме в Москву. We hope to come back again. Большое спасибо.
Взаимно, очень приятно было встретиться с вами. Спасибо.
Thanks.